The phone rang at exactly 17 minutes past midnight. My left knee was throbbing with a dull ache from the biting Ohio winter cold, and I had been lightly dozing in my worn recliner when the screen illuminated the dark room. It was Emily, my daughter. I picked up the receiver immediately on the second ring. Dad? Her voice was choked, heavily fractured by emotion. In a quarter of a second, the deep instinct of a father and the lightning-fast reflexes of a former military intelligence operative instantly merged. My mind raced, immediately assuming a horrific accident had befallen my grandchildren. Emily, what's wrong? What happened? There was a long pause. Then, I heard her weeping. It wasn't the polite crying of someone hiding their embarrassment. It was the loud, broken sobbing of someone whose reality had just shattered. Dad, why is your face suddenly appearing on every single late-night television news broadcast right now? I shot up straight in the recliner. The old television set in the corner was still glowing brightly. A late-night local news bulletin was broadcasting live. I looked from the screen down to the heavy phone in my hand. Emily, what the hell are you talking about? You were just broadcast on Channel 7, and then the exact same footage flipped over to Channel 2. Gary just found another viral video clip of you circulating massively on social media. Dad, I had absolutely no idea. I didn't know. I forcefully rubbed my tired eyes. The deep cut on the back of my knuckles still stung with a sharp pain. Daughter, take a breath. Calm down. She drew in a massive shuddering breath, her voice trembling with extreme panic. Dad, I truly honestly did not know that things had gotten this bad. And right in that exact second, before Emily could utter another syllable, I understood precisely what she was talking about. Because just 60 hours prior to this frantic call, my own daughter had called me and explicitly, coldly demanded that I not show my face at our family's Christmas dinner. The worst, most life-altering conversations rarely take place in a storm of noise. There are no ear-piercing screams of fury. There are no heavy doors slammed shut. It is usually just a few brief, quietly spoken sentences, whispered nervously over a phone line, yet they possess the devastating power to embed themselves deeply into your chest. 3 days ago, I was sitting quietly at the worn kitchen table in my modest suburban house just outside Dayton, Ohio. I was organizing utility bills and trying to pretend that my retirement was a peaceful golden era. My house is always quiet. My ex-wife and I legally divorced over 15 years ago. Ever since that ink dried, I have learned the solitary art of living completely alone. Your world gradually shrinks. The only radiant points of light remaining in that shrinking universe were always Emily and my 2 beautiful grandchildren. Or at least, that is what I had foolishly convinced myself to believe. On that particular afternoon, my cell phone buzzed. It was Emily. I instinctively smiled the second I saw her name. Hello, sweetheart. Hi. Dad. Instantly, I knew something was profoundly wrong. Any parent possesses an invisible radar. You can always detect when the pitch and cadence of their voice shift off center. Is everything all right, honey? I asked, leaning slightly forward. Yes. The answer came entirely too fast, then a heavy blanket of silence descended over the line. I slowly leaned back into my wooden chair. What is it, Emily? Talk to me. Another agonizing pause stretched out. Finally, she forced herself to speak. This year, Mom and Gary are officially hosting the big Christmas Eve dinner at my house. Gary, my ex-wife's incredibly arrogant new husband. They had been married for roughly 6 years. Gary was simply the specific breed of profoundly insecure man who possessed an insatiable craving to be the absolute center of the universe. If someone shared a modest story about catching a large fish, Gary would aggressively interrupt to loudly proclaim he had caught a fish twice that size. He was a high-level senior executive at a massive commercial real estate firm. He constantly draped himself in custom-tailored designer suits and casually flashed obscenely expensive watches that a blue-collar handyman like me couldn't afford. His entire existence was an exhausting performance of extreme wealth. But solely for Emily's sake, to maintain the fragile peace, I always made an agonizing effort to maintain a polite, detached relationship. always without fail. For Emily, all right, that's fine, I said in a perfectly even tone. So, what time should I plan to arrive? The other end of the line abruptly went dead silent. In that fraction of a second, my stomach violently twisted into a hard knot. Even before she managed to stammer out her carefully rehearsed answer, my honed instincts had already anticipated the worst. Dad? I turned my head and stared blankly out the frosted kitchen window. Thick snow was rapidly accumulating around the rusted metal mailbox. Dad, maybe this year. She hesitated, painfully drawing in a ragged breath before forcing the words out. We are really trying our absolute best to make Gary feel like he is a crucial, respected part of this family. He generously sponsored the entire financial cost of this massive catered party, and he really wants. He specifically requested that everything goes exactly his way tonight. I said absolutely nothing. For a fleeting second, I genuinely wondered if my aging ears had drastically malfunctioned. Emily nervously cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. Maybe it would just be better if you didn't come to Christmas dinner this year. Those specific words slowly drifted down into the dead air, falling as silently and heavily as thick dust. My gaze drifted over to the modest Christmas tree, standing quietly in the corner. Several faded ornaments that Emily had proudly crafted by hand in elementary school were still hanging precariously on the lowest branches. I had fiercely guarded every single one of those childish creations as if they were priceless crown jewels. But it suddenly appeared that I had cherished those fragile memories for far longer than she actually desired to keep me present in her life. Are you still there, Dad? She whispered, her voice tight with guilt. Yes, I swallowed hard, forcing the massive lump in my throat down. I'm right here, Dad. Please don't take this personally. I just really don't want to upset Gary. It's his night. That specific justification very nearly caused me to let out a bitter, echoing laugh. I could clearly hear the intense, squirming discomfort vibrating in her voice. Emily knew with absolute certainty that she was inflicting a deep, agonizing wound. She knew perfectly well that Gary was deliberately, systematically marginalizing me, pushing me entirely out of the family picture, just to monopolize the spotlight. She wasn't seeking my understanding, she was desperately seeking my explicit permission to abandon me without carrying the heavy burden of guilt. And so, swallowing my pride and my pain, I gave her exactly what she demanded. I completely understand, sweetheart, really, Dad. Of course, the lie slipped past my lips far smoother than I could have ever imagined. We exchanged a few more meaningless pleasantries about the brutal winter weather, and then the line went dead. I remained seated in that hard wooden chair, utterly alone. Outside, the violent winter wind whipped blinding sheets of white snow across the completely deserted suburban street. I sat frozen at that kitchen table for nearly 20 unbroken minutes, thinking, desperately trying to analyze my own emotional state to determine if I was actually experiencing rage. The absolute unvarnished truth. I was not angry, at least, not in that initial paralyzing moment. The only sensation that completely enveloped my body was a profound, crushing exhaustion, a deep bone-wearying fatigue radiating from the center of my soul. It felt exactly as if I had been silently carrying an impossibly massive leaden weight on my shoulders for decades, only to suddenly look around and realize that the people I was carrying it for hadn't even noticed the burden existed. They all genuinely believed I was just a tired, worn-out, retired handyman struggling to survive on a meager government pension. Gary routinely mocked my blue-collar repair work with thinly veiled insults. He constantly puffed out his chest, boasting loudly about his million-dollar corporate acquisitions. But Gary, and shockingly, even my own daughter Emily, were entirely ignorant of the dark, complex reality of my past. Absolutely no one knew the truth. My real, given name is not actually David Walker. That is simply one of the countless fabricated aliases I had seamlessly utilized throughout my career. For 30 intense, highly classified years, I operated as a senior intelligence analyst and a deep cover field operative for the Department of Defense. My absolute specialty was the relentless tracking and systematic dismantling of global money laundering syndicates and international terrorist financing networks. I had personally intercepted, analyzed, and neutralized billions of dollars of illicit, blood-soaked currency violently exposing massive demonic criminal cartels. When I finally reached the age of mandatory retirement, utterly exhausted by the relentless darkness of humanity, I deliberately chose to adopt a highly secluded, aggressively humble existence. I took on the mundane persona of a public works repairman simply to find a modicum of peace. The massive, multi-million-dollar fortune I had legitimately accumulated over my career was deeply buried in a series of heavily encrypted, impenetrable blind trusts, rendering my actual wealth completely invisible to the arrogant eyes of the civilian world. Gary arrogantly assumed I was a pathetic, clinging failure. He genuinely believed he could use a few flashy dollars to effortlessly erase me from the family portrait. He had chosen the absolute wrong man to step on. But that reckoning was a problem for tomorrow. The very next morning after that devastating phone call, operating on pure, ingrained discipline, I drove out into the freezing cold to complete my annual Christmas shopping. I meticulously selected the perfect gifts for my grandchildren. A highly sophisticated remote-controlled off-road truck for little Ethan. A premium, professional-grade oil painting set for Lily. But for Emily, I had prepared something entirely different. It possessed no significant monetary value, but its emotional weight was immeasurable. For 2 consecutive sleepless nights, I had sat hunched over my dining table, carefully cutting, pasting, and writing detailed annotations to complete a massive, leather-bound photo album. 30 years of irreplaceable, documented memories. Joyous birthday parties, quiet fishing trips on the lake, proud high school graduations. I spent agonizing hours arranging them with the utmost delicate care. By the late afternoon of Christmas Eve, the heavy album was finally complete. I wrapped it meticulously. Then, I loaded all the brightly wrapped boxes into the bed of my battered Ford pickup truck. I repeatedly, firmly told myself that I was merely executing a simple delivery. Nothing more. There would be no dramatic, tearful speeches of betrayal. No pathetic attempts to induce guilt. No shocking, uninvited grand entrance to ruin their evening. This was simply the final, unavoidable responsibility of a father providing for his children. At least, that was the precise tactical plan I had formulated. I had absolutely no conception that, before this freezing Christmas Eve concluded, my entire quiet life would be violently broadcast across national television networks, and that Gary's glittering, fabricated empire of lies would be mercilessly crushed into fine ash by my own hands. When I finally awoke on the morning of Christmas Eve, the expansive Ohio sky was a bleak, unforgiving sheet of slate gray. Decades of rigid military discipline were permanently hardwired into my central nervous system, strictly forbidding my body from sleeping in. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee and stared blankly out the kitchen window. I compulsively checked my mobile phone every few minutes. A tiny, irrational fragment of my paternal heart still hoped Emily would call and finally realize how incredibly cruel and ridiculous her banishment truly was. But the phone remained as silent as a tombstone. At approximately 10 o'clock, I hauled the wrapped gifts out and loaded them into the bed of the pickup. I drove steadily across the downtown grid, heading toward Emily's neighborhood, a newly constructed, highly exclusive gated residential project. Massive, ostentatious McMansions and perfectly manicured lawns. This was Gary's opulent kingdom. I parked my rusted truck at the curb. Through the massive bay windows, I could clearly see the towering, brilliantly lit Christmas tree. I saw the blurred silhouettes of people moving happily through the rooms, and I could faintly hear the muffled sounds of joyous laughter. For a heartbreaking moment, my hand rested heavily on the door handle. I almost knocked on that heavy mahogany door and demanded my rightful place at that table. Instead, I took a deep breath, gathered the wrapped boxes into my arms, walked swiftly up to the grand front porch, and carefully placed them down on the welcome mat. Finally, I placed the heavy photo album gently on top of the pile. I left absolutely no explanatory note. They were simply Christmas gifts from a grandfather. I stood there for one final agonizing second, and then I turned my back and walked straight to my truck. The entire delivery operation took less than 2 minutes, yet my chest ached with a physical, crushing pain. I sped away before anyone inside could even glance out the window. I returned to my incredibly empty house and spent the entire afternoon doing absolutely nothing of any value. Around 7:30 in the evening, my phone finally buzzed. It was an urgent text message from the local community crisis shelter. The weather front was rapidly deteriorating into a severe blizzard. They desperately needed additional volunteers to manage the overflow. This was the quiet, anonymous volunteer work I routinely performed. When your own life has become a vast, silent void, sometimes listening to the struggles of others is the only way to fill the crushing emptiness. I instantly typed back, "I am on my way." It wasn't until nearly 10:30 at night that the chaotic situation at the crisis shelter finally began to stabilize. The blizzard had escalated into a violent, howling monster. I quietly said my goodbyes and began the treacherous drive back to my empty house. Roughly 15 minutes into the perilous drive, peering through the violently swirling snow, I faintly spotted the chaotic beams of headlights shining at a severely unnatural angle. It was a large commercial passenger bus belonging to a local community church. The heavy front axle had violently skidded completely off the icy asphalt, sending the massive vehicle plunging nose first into a deep drainage ditch. Emergency hazard lights flashed rhythmically, and the shrieking wind relentlessly blasted thick sheets of white ice against the vehicle. I instantly slammed my truck into park, dialed 911 dispatch, and stepped out into the maelstrom. Approaching the bus, I could see the terrified passengers scrambling frantically inside. The vast majority were elderly citizens, members of a senior church choir. The driver was desperately, fruitlessly attempting to calm the chaotic situation. I forcefully pried the damaged hydraulic door open and climbed into the steeply angled cabin. The instant my boots hit the floorboards, my vocal register automatically shifted back into the sharp, commanding authority of a senior military officer. "My name is David. I am taking control of this situation. Professional rescue teams are en route right now." It was a single, authoritative statement, but it possessed the immediate power to instantly lower the temperature of the panic in the room. I moved rapidly down the tilted aisle, assessing each passenger and applying basic first aid. My analytical eyes locked onto a catastrophic hazard just outside the shattered windows. A severely damaged wooden utility pole, leaning dangerously close to the bus. A thick, high-voltage power line had snapped and was swinging wildly in the wind, missing the roof by mere inches. I instantly roared a command for absolute, total stillness. No one was permitted to stand up. Absolutely no one was allowed to attempt to exit the vehicle. Minutes later, the blaring sirens of the fire department finally pierced the storm. As I assisted the firefighters in carrying two of the most frail women down the treacherous icy steps, my heavy winter boot hit a patch of invisible black ice on the asphalt. My feet violently flew out from under me. I crashed heavily onto the unforgiving frozen pavement. My left knee twisted viciously under the full weight of my falling body. A blinding, searing pain shot straight up my hip, and the rough ice tore a deep, bloody gash across the back of my hand. By the time every single passenger had been successfully evacuated, a local television news crew had managed to arrive at the scene. A young female reporter aggressively interviewed the survivors. She eventually shoved her microphone directly into my face while I was sitting exhausted on the rear bumper of an ambulance, allowing a paramedic to wrap a thick bandage around my bleeding hand. The young reporter leaned in closer, the brutal wind whipping her blonde hair. "Do you have a family waiting up for you at home tonight, sir?" I remember that exact moment with crystal clarity. A sharp bite of cold air, a profound wave of intense loneliness, and an overwhelming, crushing exhaustion. The words that slipped past my lips were simply the unvarnished, brutal truth. I offered the camera a tired, sad smile and simply replied, "Not tonight." The reporter looked genuinely taken aback. "You don't have any plans at all for Christmas Eve?" I slowly shook my head, staring dead directly into the black lens of the camera. This year, my daughter specifically requested that I not attend. That was it. The entire unedited broadcast clip lasted a grand total of 20 seconds. There was absolutely no explosive anger in my voice. Just a quiet, incredibly sad statement of undeniable fact. But that simple, quiet truth proved to be the most devastating, high-yield weapon imaginable. When I finally limped back into my house and collapsed heavily into my worn recliner, I genuinely believed I would pass out from exhaustion instantly. That was, until my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the side table. Emily's frantic, sobbing phone call shattered the silence. She had seen the broadcast. "Why didn't you tell me you were out there in that storm?" Emily's voice cracked over the speaker, oscillating wildly between hysterical sobbing and pure panic. I replied in a slow, deep, perfectly even tone, "Because exactly 6 hours ago, you called me to explicitly dictate exactly where I was not permitted to be tonight. I had absolutely no reason to believe you cared where I went." That calm, factual response delivered a far more devastating psychological blow than I had even intended. A suffocating silence stretched across the line. Finally, she managed to whisper a broken "Dad," and completely froze. The call abruptly ended in agonizing awkwardness. There was no apology offered. Not yet. Exactly 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed Gary's name. I answered. "David." Gary's voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with fake cheerfulness. "Quite an eventful, noisy night out there, huh? I just wanted to call and say, what you did out there at the crash site, that was really fantastic work. Listen, Emily is feeling really terrible right now. She absolutely didn't mean to hurt your feelings, Dave." I remained absolutely silent. Gary frantically tried to fill the void. I mean, this whole thing was just a big miscommunication. "You understand how these things happen during the holidays, right?" I still said absolutely nothing. Finally, unable to handle the crushing pressure of my silence, Gary angrily gave up and hung up. The arrogant fool actually believed that a few cheap platitudes could allow him to control the narrative. He was catastrophically wrong. The very next morning, I woke up to dozens of notifications. That brief 20-second video clip had gone massively viral across social media. The internet didn't particularly care about the bus crash itself. What ignited their fury was my quiet, heartbreaking answer. Thousands of comments poured in from absolute strangers, sharing their own painful stories about the crushing loneliness of old age and the agony of being abandoned during the holidays. A tenacious, investigative journalist named Rachel Bennett reached out to me. Although I declined an official interview, she dug deep into public records and published a massive, front-page exposé detailing my 12 years of silent, anonymous community volunteer work. That comprehensive article detonated with even more explosive force than the original video. As the online sleuths aggressively connected the dots, they arrived at a damning question. If this wealthy executive Gary is constantly posting photos projecting the image of a perfect family, why on earth was this heroic grandfather forced to eat dinner entirely alone on Christmas Eve? The blazing fury of public opinion instantly locked onto Gary like a heat-seeking missile. Dozens of his high-profile corporate partners began flooding his phone with angry texts. He was staring down the barrel of an absolute public relations nightmare. But for me, public humiliation was nowhere near enough. A trained intelligence operative never allows his enemy a moment to regroup. I needed to uncover the actual hidden tactical motive behind Gary's actions. Why would an incredibly busy corporate executive expend so much calculated effort to deliberately isolate a supposedly harmless retired handyman from his own daughter? I locked the heavy oak door of my home office, booted up the multi-layered, heavily encrypted computer system I had secretly retained from my military days, and initiated a ruthless digital sweep of my arrogant son-in-law's entire existence, his global financial history, offshore banking transactions, and the internal operations of his real estate firm. It took me less than 72 hours to unearth the answer. Gary was not a successful executive. His entire commercial real estate firm was actually operating as a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme. He was currently drowning in millions of dollars of insurmountable debt owed to highly dangerous investors. In a desperate attempt to maintain his luxurious facade, he had illegally forged the signature of his ex-wife, Linda, to fraudulently secure a massive second mortgage on her private residence. Far more horrifyingly, I discovered that he had been methodically maneuvering to seize total legal control over Emily's personal bank accounts. His aggressive campaign to push me out wasn't just born of petty jealousy. It was a highly calculated tactical maneuver. He actively needed to isolate Emily and sever the protective bond between my daughter and her only remaining father figure. Once I was out of the picture, he could easily drain her massive trust fund to desperately cover his fraudulent debts without any oversight. That lavish Christmas Eve party was nothing more than a cheap smokescreen designed to generate positive social media photos, desperately proving to his panicked investors that he was still a stable family man. I smiled, a smile as cold and unforgiving as glacial ice. Actively plotting to completely obliterate my daughter's financial future was an absolute, non-negotiable death sentence. I systematically downloaded every single damning bank statement, the fraudulent mortgage contracts, and the irrefutable evidence of Gary's offshore shell companies onto a secure USB drive. I wasn't just going to embarrass him. I was going to violently, publicly, and permanently annihilate his entire life. 1 week later, the Dayton City Council officially decided to host a massive gala to honor the heroes of winter. My name was prominently featured at the very top of the VIP list. When Rachel casually mentioned that Gary's corporate business association was one of the primary financial sponsors of the event, I immediately changed my mind about declining. It became glaringly obvious. Gary was attempting to salvage his rapidly disintegrating public image by purchasing an expensive sponsor table and intentionally parading Emily around at the ceremony honoring me, broadcasting to his investors, "Our family is perfectly fine. David Walker and I are a strong, united family." The gala took place on a freezing Saturday evening at the massive Dayton Event Center. I arrived wearing a dark, custom-tailored suit that radiated the quiet, terrifying aura of a man who wielded immense power. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom, my eyes immediately locked onto their table. Emily offered a small wave. Gary flashed a sickeningly fake smile, completely oblivious to the fact that the Grim Reaper was currently standing right behind his chair. The ceremony commenced. The host loudly called my name to the main stage. The entire packed ballroom instantly rose to their feet, delivering a deafening standing ovation. Gary was clapping louder than anyone else, desperately ensuring every press camera captured footage of him playing the proud son-in-law. It was absolutely nauseating. The host firmly shook my hand and spoke directly into the microphone. "David, looking back on it now, what was the absolute hardest part of that freezing Christmas Eve for you?" The massive auditorium fell completely silent. I accepted the microphone. I slowly, deliberately let my gaze sweep across the entire audience, before firmly locking my eyes directly onto Gary. "The absolute hardest part," I began, my voice rich and carrying the penetrating edge of a serrated combat knife, "was not enduring the sub-zero temperatures. The hardest part was the horrific realization that my own daughter had been systematically manipulated into believing that a sociopathic, narcissistic con artist actually deserved my rightful place at the head of her table on Christmas Eve." The entire ballroom of hundreds of people simultaneously gasped in collective shock. Emily violently clamped her hands over her mouth, hot tears immediately streaming down her face. Gary's face underwent a catastrophic transformation. He turned as pale as a corpse. Every single news camera in the room instantly whipped around and zoomed in tightly on his horrified face. But I was far from finished. I calmly reached inside my tailored suit jacket and smoothly withdrew a thick manila folder and the encrypted USB drive. I walked down the short steps of the stage directly toward the chief of police and the regional representative from the Internal Revenue Service, seated at the premier VIP table. And speaking of sociopathic con artists, I continued, my voice booming through the massive speakers. I firmly believe that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the IRS, and every single defrauded investor involved with Coleman real estate investments will be incredibly interested in the contents of this specific file. I forcefully dropped the heavy folder onto the table, directly in front of the police chief. Inside that folder is the irrefutable evidence of a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. It explicitly proves that Gary Coleman has embezzled millions from his investors. Furthermore, it contains proof that he maliciously forged the legal signature of his ex-wife, Linda, to fraudulently mortgage her private home. And, most despicably, it details his active efforts to establish dummy shell corporations intended to completely drain his current wife's, my daughter's private trust fund to finance his escape. This time, the reaction was absolute chaotic pandemonium. Gary stumbled backward in pure terror, his foot catching violently on a chair, and he crashed heavily to the ballroom floor. His entire meticulously crafted illusion had been violently stripped away. "You are lying! This is insane slander!" Gary frantically screamed, his voice cracking in hysterical panic. But not a single person moved to help him up. The journalists surged forward like sharks smelling blood, aggressively shoving microphones and flashing blinding camera strobes directly into his distorted face. The police chief rapidly flipped through the financial documents. His eyes instantly hardened. He immediately signaled to the two uniformed officers stationed at the ballroom doors, ordering them to move in on Gary. I casually tossed the microphone back to the completely stunned host. "Now that is the real news story of the winter. Merry belated Christmas, Gary." And with that, I turned my back on the chaos and walked purposefully out the grand double doors. I left behind a broken man who was desperately screaming, as the cold, unforgiving steel of police handcuffs was ratcheted tightly around his wrists on live, statewide television. Gary was convicted and sentenced to 15 agonizing years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and massive tax evasion. His glittering fake real estate empire completely vaporized overnight. Linda's massive mansion was aggressively foreclosed upon. He had instantly been transformed into an anonymous number, wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. However, I absolutely refused to allow my innocent grandchildren to be thrown out onto the freezing streets. Utilizing a highly secure, anonymous shell company, I secretly purchased a beautiful, incredibly safe home in cash, locking the deed inside an impenetrable trust. Emily and the children were granted the permanent legal right to reside there safely. But Linda, and any future man Emily might decide to date, possessed absolutely no legal right to touch a single brick of that property. The night after that explosive gala, Emily slowly walked up the driveway to my house. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, hugging me exactly the way she used to when she was a little girl. "I am so incredibly, unbelievably sorry, Dad," she whispered. It was a raw, genuine apology from a woman who had just terrifyingly realized that she had almost allowed a parasitic monster to completely destroy her life. "Can we ever fix this, Dad?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperate hope. I looked down at her and honestly replied, "Maybe. While true forgiveness can be granted in a single heartbeat, rebuilding shattered trust requires a grueling process of reconstruction." Emily understood my meaning instantly. She didn't arrogantly demand immediate total absolution. Over the next several months, our progress was slow and incredibly cautious. We began meeting for a simple lunch together exactly once a month. Eventually, the children were allowed to run and play in my backyard on the weekends again. But some fundamental aspects of our relationship had been permanently altered. I had scheduled a meeting with my estate attorney to officially restructure my final will. A heavily monitored portion of the estate would still be allocated to Emily. A significant percentage was locked into an educational trust fund for my grandchildren, and the vast majority of the remaining fortune was redirected to completely fund the operations of the downtown homeless shelter. In late August, I received an official letter informing me that I had been selected to receive the prestigious Honorary State Volunteer Award. The invitation explicitly stated that each honoree was permitted to bring exactly one guest. When I mentioned the upcoming ceremony, I could distinctly hear the eager flare of hope suddenly rise in Emily's voice. "Have you decided who you are going to bring?" she asked. I looked away from her. I am going to bring Eleanor with me." Eleanor was the incredibly grumpy, sharp-tongued, but deeply kind elderly woman whom I had physically carried off that freezing crashed bus on Christmas Eve. She had since become a very close, cherished friend. A heavy, painful silence washed over the table, and then slowly Emily offered a soft, profoundly understanding smile. "That makes perfect sense, Dad. She absolutely deserves to be there with you." And it was in that precise moment that I finally knew we were actually going to be okay. She had finally learned how to gracefully accept the consequences of losing something she had taken for granted. That was the absolute ultimate, most devastating revenge I could have ever achieved. I still love my daughter deeply. I will always ruthlessly protect her from predatory monsters like Gary. But I will absolutely never again reserve an empty chair at my table for people who only remember my name when the bright lights of the cameras are turned on. Never make the catastrophic mistake of confusing the quiet stillness of an older man for weakness. Because hidden carefully beneath the stained jacket of a simple handyman, there might very well be a terrifying demon who has already walked through the fires of hell, completely prepared to burn to ash anyone who dares to disrespect his family. For all the men and women out there who have spent their lives quietly providing for their families, never asking for a parade or a medal, this story is for you. We live in a world that increasingly values loud, empty performances over quiet, steady dedication. People like Gary believe they can buy respect and bulldoze over the foundations laid by others. They believe their wealth gives them the divine right to discard anyone who doesn't perfectly fit into their manicured, Instagram-ready aesthetic. But respect is not a commodity that can be purchased, and loyalty is not something you can demand through manipulation. I shared this deeply personal, incredibly painful chapter of my life, not out of a desire for petty revenge, but as a stark warning to anyone who might be taking their quiet, steady parents for granted. The people who faithfully show up for you, who fix your broken things, and who love you without requiring a spotlight, are the absolute bedrock of your life. Do not ever push them aside to make room for someone who only loves the sound of their own voice. If you found this story compelling, and you agree with how the father handled this horrific betrayal, please don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel to catch our next thrilling story. Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on the brutal, satisfying price that the arrogant son-in-law had to pay. Do you think Emily deserved a second chance? How would you have handled Gary at that gala? Stay safe, always protect your true family, and I will see you next time.